Well, good evening, everybody. That was a little song, the instrument from Chengdu, China, celebrating Jack's love of Lao Tse. And I got this instrument there, and it could be a way of wishing everybody a happy, almost the end of winter. And for those around who are suffering a cold freeze, it's certainly chillier, probably in Chengdu, and certainly chillier in Dublin, Ireland, where next week's guest is awaiting us, the wonderful Boran Maestro, who'll be with us next week. And for all of you who might be cold, we hope this warms your hearts up, because we have from Orlando, Florida, which is not yet a snow belt at the moment, we hope, Mr. Bob Keeling, great author, journalist, who's the person who is responsible for the Kerouac House writer's residence not being bulldozed and made into a Howard Johnson's or another fast food emporium, but rather a center for the arts in Central Florida, where Jack wrote some of his greatest books and encouraged a lot of other people to be creative themselves. And this whole program has been about celebrating collaboration, creativity with Jack Kerouac as a great spirit, as well as a great writer who encouraged other people to be successful. There's Steve Eddington, whom you see, who was formerly the president of Lowell Celebrates Kerouac, who's written a wonderful book, and a lot of loyal folks we know from all over. And so glad just to see anybody and everybody and celebrate one of our great writers and great spirits who, after all these years, is emerging from the cesspool of misinformation and being acknowledged by a new generation of people who actually read his books rather than reading books about what a creep he was not, but was supposed to be according to the books, which are fine because we all do the best we can. Those of us who were blessed to know him haven't had much of a chance to either be interviewed or write about it, which is why I wrote the book. And a lot of other people, Joyce Johnson and Carolyn Cassidy, and many of the great women writers have written fantastic books about him. And so has Steve Eddington, and so is a whole new generation of people. And hopefully this program will appeal to them. And we want to thank Pamela Dickerson, without whom this event never would have happened. Her great compadre and associate, Mr. Anthony Demarbiex, a terrific actor, artist, stand-up comedian, composer, musician, and technical genius who somehow gets us all online here as well as overseas in Canada, and without whom we couldn't possibly do this. And all of you who have come and hopefully will be encouraged to be creative yourselves and encourage your friends, young and old, to read the works of Jack Kerouac. He was the best authority on his life and the best biographer, because all of his books came from his own amazing life experiences, which he blessed. So I'm going to end up, we only have 4 more readings. We'll be done the reading of this book called Offbeat Collaborating with Kerouac. The whole second part of the book was about collaborating with Jack after he left us, after working with him for 12 years. The spirit that he had continues up until this very day, and these were just a few of the events that we had. And last week, we just completed the wonderful time that we had when we were all working together, and Jack had passed away, but we were doing stuff in Orlando, Florida, and in San Francisco and his places. And now we're moving on to a new era just around the turn of the century. And Lenny Gross, an old friend of mine, the last paragraph said, from last week said, "Well, David," said Lenny, "it's good to know you're still a man of few words. I'm going to get ready to go up to my place in Oneonta, New York, upstate New York, with the kids and bring in the new millennium and turn on my computer and see if cyberspace is still there. I'll see and talk to you in the next century." This is page 250 for those of you who actually have the book and are reading it. "You know what, Lenny," I said, "we'll have 100 years to get everything cooled out that went wrong in the last century. As Dizzy Gillespie used to say, we'll put some new ingredients into the pot." On New Year's Eve, our whole family got together at Michelle Birdie's house down the road from our farm. We all played music together, and John Cohen, who was the still photographer for Pull My Daisy way back in 1959, was also there, playing his banjo and guitar. He lived a mile from our farm. When we all sat in a circle playing music, I thought about what was now the last century, the 20th century, and what those of us who were overlapping centuries had to do in this brand new millennium. As we played old folk songs, I thought about what this new century would bring to my own 3 children and eventually to their children and their children's children. Miraculously, it seemed that our time so long ago had now arrived, and those of us who remained primary sources had an increasing obligation, whether we liked it or not, to clarify to others what we had all shared, each from our own personal perspective. Even those of us in music who would never dare to pass judgments on works of literature were certain that Jack's work was never going to be dismissed again. Books like Some of the Dharma by Jack were recently published for the first time. Archival recordings of readings were finally being released for the first time. Jack's journals were going to be published and made available for the first time. He was now clearly viewed by a new generation of scholars as the engine that pulled the train. He seemed to be everywhere. Jack was right now. His presence was felt by a worldwide audience. At the dawn of this new millennium, more than 20 of his books were in print, and more due to be published. In many languages all over the world, artists in all fields were inspired by him. This shared inspiration came from reading his books. "By your works ye shall be known," we used to tell each other during the course of endless conversations, as a reaffirmation of why we should never stop creating, no matter what setbacks occurred in our lives. 99% of the great performances, conversations, shared ideas, words of advice, and moments of tenderness and compassion that we all shared were no longer with us. We were of the moment. The only precious 1% of what had been written down, recorded, filmed, or accurately reported remained. That precious 1% was emblematic of our motto: "By your works ye shall be known." What still remained to enrich our lives all these years later reminded me of the messenger in the book of Job, when he said, "I alone am escaped to tell thee." Jack was that messenger. Jack was our reporter. He escaped to tell us. By his work, he now was known. His brakeman's shining lantern from his railroading days was still shedding light on a whole era, and shedding light on all of us as well. We were now in many ways the beneficiaries of his triumph over neglect, misinterpretation, and the pain that he endured. He was being set free at last, pardoned from a life century in what I call the penitentiary of the Beat generation. He was now viewed as Jack Kerouac, prolific author of over 25 public books you would like to share with all of your friends. Long time ago, he had set up a mirror for America to see itself, and that reflection was now being seen by all of us in his true beauty. The light that he shed and the reflection he cast was helping the whole world to see those diamonds in the sidewalk, which were the precious stones of our everyday life. Through his vision, we could see and take part in the beauty that surrounded us. Like Walt Whitman's immortal lines in Leaves of Grass, "Take my leaves, America," Jack had shared and spread his message. By a lifetime of documenting his own journey and spiritual quest, he had raised the spirits of people from every walk of life. Anyone reading his books felt that they were now able to pursue their own secret dreams in some way. He made his readers feel that they were all on their own road, and that creating from your own experience would always have a special meaning. At the dawn of this new millennium, Jack's books were now like a sweet song in the early morning sunrise of a distant bird in flight, like Charlie Bird Parker himself, telling us through his music that we would make it through the night and the days to come. By his inclusive nature and appetite for experiences and knowledge, Jack personified through his writing the golden part of our era, those gifts that we all shared. We knew that the support we received from our elders was our Montezuma's buried treasure. It was our hidden gold and a source for strength that nurtured all of us and taught us to listen, to pay attention, to open up our minds and hearts, and to appreciate one another. How beautiful to be playing music with a group of people who love it. What a great way to start the new millennium, I said to myself. Jack understood, as all of us did, from the shared egalitarian environment of the late-night jam session, that each person blowing their solo was telling their own story in their own way. Even the cutting contest, where musicians would be inspired to new heights as they try to blow each other off the bandstand, was really a good-natured dialogue and a sharing of musical ideas. It was about bringing out the greatness in you, not about who was the greatest. As I watched the happy faces of everyone sitting in a circle and playing together, I hoped that their serenading this new millennium would be the harbinger of a new way of thinking about collaborating with one another, as Jack and I had done. I remember those crazy nights in the 50s when somebody and everybody seemed to be in competition with everybody else. "Judge that ye be not judged," would be thunderously proclaimed by the lovable red-faced Greek artist Demarbiex Koldus. He was to Jack and me and all of us at the Cedar Tavern or at a painter's loft party. Whenever any comparison of one artist to the other ever took place. "We are part of a continuum that goes back to ancient Greece. Your vitality in this young country of yours is intoxicating, but your immaturity is deplorable. You cannot compare oranges and apples. If you drank more of our modern-day Greek wine of the gods, Ratsina, instead of those terrible blended American whiskeys, you would be closer to the ancient forces of the Hellenic civilization that made European culture and the New World possible. We were a nation of great playwrights, architects, sculptors, poets, and philosophers when you English people were living in caves. But I am not judgmental or asking you to compare a person of English-speaking descent to a person like myself, who is heir to the golden age of civilization. Comparing any one of you to me is impossible and unfair to you. That would be like trying to compare a child's tricycle to a chariot of the gods. Aristodemos called us his lack of modesty would usually precipitate a bigger argument, the one that occurred before Koldus gave us his infomercial. But we loved his warmth, his lectures, and his personal style of painting. And after several Ratsinas, which he sometimes snuck into the Cedar Tavern in a bottle hidden inside of his large coat, he would soar off into harangues worthy of the driver of one of those ancient Greek chariots. Koldus told us that the athletic competitions in ancient Greece were also celebrations for the whole nation, and that our modern-day Olympics were a pale imitation of the original events. that were viewed as a religious rite and a huge week-long party, almost like the Brazilian carnival of a whole nation dancing together, rather than who is the best ego fest. Coldus, along with so many others of our elders, made us understand that you shouldn't ever try to compare the relative artists or merits of authors or poets as if they were athletes competing against one another. We realized by our proximity to seasoned artists like Coldus that you could no more compare painters, poets, and architects to one another than you could compare whipped cream to camembert cheese. In the arts, where the interpretation of existing material is the cornerstone of creation, we understood that if 35 different actors played Hamlet, each actor would find his own truth in his own portrayal. All 35 of these actors shared one common goal. They were all in their own way trying to create a once-in-a-lifetime Hamlet from their own bodies and psyches. Their fellow actors, the director, and the audience could choose which Hamlet touched them the most, but that had nothing to do with being the best or the worst. It had to do with how people who judged each performance felt themselves about each experience. Shakespeare had already created Hamlet, so all 35 actors were starting their journey at the exact same point of departure. But what they did after that point of departure was unique for each performer. When comparing composers to one another or authors to one another, we realized that we could only share our opinions and enthusiasm about special compositions or books that touched us. We could judge the creations, not the creators. Flaubert me no Flauberts, Thomas Wolfe wrote to F. Scott Fitzgerald. Wolfe knew he had his own voice. He wasn't trying to be an impersonator or a ventriloquist, and he felt that his work shouldn't and couldn't be compared to the writing style of Flaubert or anyone else. Jack and I both knew that the relationship we had with our readers or listeners was crucial. Those readers or listeners had to become engaged in a dialogue with our work. If that dialogue didn't take place, they would close Jack's books or turn off their recordings of my music and turn on their TV set. Jack used to always say that all he wanted to do was to tell a story and carry the reader along with him, the way Charlie Parker or Lester Young would improvise on a familiar song and take the listener to a new place. Jack also said to me and many others that the story of his life was a recounting of a great journey, and that was akin to a modern-day legend. All his experiences were part of one huge lifelong novel narrated by him. He wasn't interested in comparing himself to anybody. He never criticized other writers and always encouraged budding authors, poets, musicians, and artists of all kinds because he felt we were all doing God's work when we told our stories. He often told me that writing was a form of confession and that the deep spiritual gratification of the act of confession in church was akin to the explanation of his feelings when he wrote. As a natural musician, he loved poetry as much as he loved prose, and he could let his mind soar along with the sounds of any poet whose work he was reading and listen for the beauty. I told Jack one night at the Cedar Tavern in 1959 how I was finally able to understand how we could see and hear the beauty in practically anything that occurred. I recounted to him the time I visited Thelonious Monk's apartment in the fall of 1955 when I was playing with Charles Mingus. We both sat in silence at Monk's house for nearly an hour, while his radio was turned on into a country and western singer playing three chords and moaning and groaning in a nasal monotone. It wasn't Jimmy Rogers, Patsy Cline, Tennessee Ernie Ford, or any of the hundreds of great country singers of the day who would captivate you immediately with their own individual soulfulness. It sounded like someone who was either related to the program director of the radio station we were listening to or someone who had taken the station hostage. He was wheezing as if he had just finished loading up a barn full of hay. I told Jack I could never figure out who that country singer was, but seeing Monk totally absorbed made me realize I had no right to be judgmental, and that perhaps, having just turned 25, I should simply shut up and pay attention to what captivated him. After about an hour, I couldn't restrain myself. "Thelonious," I said, "did you like that music?" Monk sat motionless in silence. After about a minute, he said, "Listen to the drummer." I told Jack I almost fell off my chair when Monk said that. I began to listen as hard as I ever consciously have listened to anything in my life. I could hear, as faintly as the sound of a breeze blowing against a window, through the noise of distant traffic and occasional honking of horns of a New York City afternoon, the sound of a drummer, muffled in tone. I kept straining to hear the drum as the singer gasped and moaned. "I don't know how they shot my cow." I focused all my energy on trying to hear the drummer, who galvanized Monk's attention. Another song played. Towards the end of it, Monk slowly lifted his head and looked at me with his all-seeing gaze and smiled. "Check out his brushwork." I listened, and sure enough, I was able to distinguish the sound of the drummer's subtle use of wire brushes on his hi-hat, ride cymbal, and snare drums, playing some original-sounding patterns, almost like a country version of Big Sid Catlett, the master of the use of brushes in jazz drumming. I told Jack how Monk showed me how to listen and how to always look for the beauty, just as Jack himself had told me to look for those diamonds in the sidewalk. "You have to listen," said Jack. "You always have to keep searching. The beauty is all around us." The Iroquois knew about all this. The Navajo prayer of the 12th night addresses pursuing that trail of beauty by being on it. We're the messengers. We are telling our stories to inspire people to remember their own. I wish I could play a horn, Davy, just to be able to wail in touch with the truth. No words, just pure truth. That's what the ancient Greek poets had in their work, and the Bible, in Latin, French, and English, is just like hearing God speaking. Gregory Corso knew this. He was brought up in the church too. When he went to jail, he read constantly. He understands the classic writers as well as Keats and Shelley and the poetry of the streets. He is a classicist like Philip Lamantia and Howard Hart. And he can swing. Phil Whalen and Creeley, Lawrence Ferlinghetti and Dylan Thomas, Langston Hughes and William Carlos Williams, they're all like music. Gregory had that natural gift. Someday he'll be appreciated. All of these memories played up in my mind as I accompanied everyone in that room on my Demarbiex. "Daddy, you look like you're totally spaced out," said my second daughter, Adira. "It's only 2 a.m. Don't tell me you're getting tired." "No," I said. "I'm just going over the final playback of my own collection of the greatest hits of the 20th century." "We should be filming this," said John Cohn, "a rural upstate New York version of Pull My Daisy 50 years later." "We need Gregory here to be the leading man," I said. I remembered again that winter in New York, January 1959, when we were making Pull My Daisy. Jack still had a real closeness to Gregory, Alan, and Jack had differences, as all his friends do since then. And Alan, with his brilliant analytical mind, loved to argue loudly with everybody and deliver thunderous denunciation of society's inequities, almost like Leon Trotsky on speed. And often Jack would tune him out. I always enjoyed hearing Alan's tirades and would interrupt him by quoting Dylan Thomas, "Rage, rage against the dying of the night," interrupting him until I could get him to burst out laughing or scream at me, which would then give Gregory Corso a chance to shout at Alan. When we were all at the Cedar Tavern, Alan and Gregory and many of us would have shouting arguments where we could scarcely hear each other. Since Alan was gifted with a huge voice that could fill a room when he really got enthusiastic or angry, Gregory developed a high-pitched braying sound like a donkey, where he would occasionally provide an obligato to Alan's shouting by blasting out Don Rickles-style series of comical insults about anybody present, including himself. We always thought this was a good-humored way of letting off our mutually seeming endless youthful energies, and were always surprised that some people found this behavior obnoxious. Jack was never comfortable when this kind of behavior occurred outside of the confines of wherever he was staying. He never acted this way, nor did anyone else in the presence of his mother, who, contrary to so much of what was written about her, was a warm woman with an endless love for Jack. She believed in good manners and demanded respect when you were in her home. I was brought up this way and felt very comfortable with her. She did not care for Alan, which he found upsetting, but rather than thinking there might be some reason why she disliked him, he blamed her for disliking him. Even though Jack and Alan had slowly parted ways in the 1950s, Jack always had a soft spot in his heart for Gregory, as we all did, and kept hoping that some sun would shine on his life and that his star would ascend. "He's a great lyric poet," Jack would say, sometimes muttering in my ear, so Gregory wouldn't hear him. "You're goddamn right I am," Gregory would shout, "and I'm irresistible to women." Through the years, Gregory had good times and a lot of hard times. Those of us who knew him from the mid-50s were his biggest cheering section. Once at a big conference in 1994, where I had to speak, play, rap, accompany, and fill in for people who forgot to show up or were out in the hallway engaged in the heated, non-stop discussions, I would take a breather during my 2 free hours before an afternoon concert of world music. My oldest daughter, Alana, and my son, Adam, burst into our hotel room, where I was lying down while copying some music I had written. They were at the auditorium out in Boulder, where Gregory was giving a reading and talk. They both loved Gregory, as we all did. "Daddy, you've got to hurry over to the auditorium right now. Gregory's been insulting you for 10 minutes. He's so funny. He's hysterical. You'd love it." "That's a real compliment, Alana," I said. "It's like a roast that you see on TV when all the old comedians insult each other. It's a dying art form." I rushed over, but by the time I got there, he was on another monologue, insulting all the great songwriters of the 60s that we all admired, beaming with a toothless, devilish grin when a young person would look upset. When he was done, I went up on stage where he was talking to a group of high school-age kids who were showing him their poems. He talked to each one and gave each of them suggestions about their poetry, made helpful comments, and gave each of them encouragement. "Well, Dave, you finally showed up. I saw you kids out there. You missed it. You know all the poems of mine I read, but you missed the zingers. I was really giving it to you, man. I got you good. You would have loved it." He turned to the kids who were still standing quietly, ready to show him more of their poetry or just hear him speak. "You know who this old guy is?" said Gregory. "He's Mez McGillicuddy, a washed-up actor.
He was in one movie called Pull My Daisy in 1959. He hasn't been in a film since or had another acting job. He's a one-shot total failure in show business. I was fabulous in the film. I still get fan mail from around the world telling me how photogenic I am. Poor Mess can't get a date. Even his dog feels sorry for him. These are two of Mess's kids. He's lucky they look like his wife. Planned Parenthood withdrew his membership. Look at him. He's 93 years old and still auditioning for a second movie role. We should take up a collection and get him a facelift.
The high school kids looked stunned. My two kids burst into laughter. All the kids started laughing. Gregory threw his arm around me.
We gotta show these kids how to stop taking themselves so seriously,
he said.
Kids, don't take yourselves so seriously. Take what you do seriously. Stop watching TV and playing video games and go to the library and read a book. Go to Dave's concert this afternoon, if his respirator's hooked up, and learn to listen to something that's not coming out of a machine. Let me see some more of those poems.
Gregory had a high tolerance for pain. Maybe Mez will back you up when you read one the way he did for Kerouac, if you tip him $1, said Alan. You can keep the $1, Gregory, I said. I'd be happy for any of you if you want to read with my music, and I'm not scheduled to do anything else. That's why I'm here. Gregory spent almost an hour surrounded by teenage poets and authors, their parents, and anyone who happened to be there who wanted to talk to him.
Dave, let's go out and eat, man. I'm burnt out.
My kids wanted to go back to the motel room and take a shower, and then meet us. We walked them to my room, and then went to Daddy Bruce's barbecue to hang out with Daddy Bruce's son, who had an old upright piano and wanted me to show him different ways of voicing chords. Gregory and I both attacked some barbecue and talked.
I get so tired of putting on an act, said Gregory. I keep thinking of Jack and how he felt trapped by having to fulfill other people's expectations. He was supposed to be the king of the beatniks. I guess I was supposed to be the clown prince. And you're supposed to be the troubadour. Jesus Christ, man. Jack's one of the great literary innovators of the century. I know I'm a great lyric poet, a throwback to Keats and Shelley, and you write symphonies and operas and play all kinds of music. What do we have to do? At least you and Jack are now taken seriously. No one calls you a beat composer or a beatnik musician or a beat conductor. They still call me a beat poet. What a bunch of crap.
Gregory looked actually upset.
A bunch of crap.
He banged his fork on the table, and the succulent barbecue sauce speckled my old blue jacket, making it look like my blazer had caught measles. What's the trouble, Gregory? Is your barbecue too mild? I'll give you some more sauce, said Daddy Bruce's son.
Nah, said Gregory. The barbecue's great. It's just my life that's giving me problems.
Gregory continued talking about his role as the clown prince of beat poetry.
I get asked to do all these readings without getting paid very much. I don't want to read my poems once they're finished. I'm only interested in writing them. Once they're written, and I know they're complete, they belong to the world. I'm done with them. I need the money. That's the only reason for me to leave the house. I don't want to do any more readings unless I get paid well. I'm saying no most of the time, unless it's for Jack. If it's for Jack, I'll always do it. He deserves it. But this beat mythology crap is driving me crazy. Why don't they ask me to get the facts straight? When they make an error about a scene I was part of, I tell them, instead of thanking me for telling the truth, they get angry, and they don't believe me even when I get others who were there to back me up.
When we were finished eating, Daddy Bruce's son came over and asked me to play some standards on the piano. "You show me, tomorrow bring your French horn, I'll play backup for you," he said. I played the piano until my kids showed up. Gregory and I had second helpings as our kids wolfed down the secret recipe treasures of Daddy Bruce's grease-filled ecstasy barbecue chicken and Reb's dinner. Even though I was a vegetarian most of the time, Daddy Bruce's barbecue canceled out all dietary restrictions. And next week we're going to read some more, but I would like now to introduce the person who created this program, and she will tell you about the video, I guess, that we're going to see. And also the video we're going to see is about our very special guest, Mr. Bob Keeling. And I'll tell you more about Bob's extraordinary achievements as a person who wrote a beautiful article in the Orlando paper mentioning that there was this old house where Jack Kerouac had lived in the very back room with no air conditioning with his mother when On the Road was being completed, and that Joyce Johnson had sent $30 to him via the Postal Express so that he could, Western Union, so that he could take a bus, get a sandwich and take a bus and come to New York in September of 1957 in case this book somehow got a good review somewhere. And that's all described magnificently in Joyce's book, Minor Characters. But after Jack had completed that and then overnight become a worldwide figure, he went back to that same little house and he wrote the whole book, The Dharma Bums. And the house was about to be demolished, and Bob Keeling, who was a top NBC reporter and had a program, a news program, somehow found out about that and thought maybe there was something that could be done. I wrote this extraordinary article which someone sent me, and I said, man, if I could be of any help. So to make a long story short, all these years later, Bob is now writing his fifth book, this one about the Beatles in Florida, and the place that he had dreamed of with Summer Rodman and Marty Cummins is now a full year-round going concern where writers can come from every country in the world, regardless of their style, age, heights, race, credentials, all that stuff, on the basis of their writing, and be a writer in residence and live in the same house that Jack did when he wrote. And most of them don't have writer's blocks as a result. They're all out there writing up a storm and doing very well since then, and more are on the way. So that was a dream that our gentleman who's coming here today, Bob Keeling, made possible. Now he's on to other things, as we all are, but we're just so glad for all of you who are watching that you could see one of the genuine people. And his amazing book of Jack's 12 years in Florida is a classic and never would have been written. And if it were, it wouldn't have been written that well, because Bob, as a trained news person and an avid reader of Jack Kerouac, did years and years and years of research and got it right. So now please welcome Pamela, who will tell you about the film we're about to see.
Hello, welcome everybody. Sending lots of love to you all and the universe. And I want to say I'm so thankful that on this beautiful Valentine's Day, I'm with some of my favorite people, starting with David Amaram and our mutual great love of Jack Kerouac, and the journey that it's brought me on, James Canary, and my dear friend from LA, Norton Wisdom. And we have Paul Carey's here, one of the extended members of the Dharma Bums band. And it is a great honor to have such a sacred soul and intelligent wisdom carrier in the universe, Bob Keeling. And welcome. And as you're such a brilliant newsman, reporter, well-spoken, I'd love for you to introduce the video. But Anthony's computer just died, so he's got to plug in and things. So how about we welcome Bob Keeling, you unmic yourself, and we chat with you a little bit with David. Hello, you're still mic'd. Bottom left corner, there's a little microphone. If you touch your screen, then the bottom left corner, it says mute or unmute. Yay, hello. We've all gone through the same thing.
Yes, welcome. I think it's the cosmos saying we're not quite ready for you yet. That's what I think it is.
Well, I think we're ready for you not to go anywhere else. Just right on you.
Well, it's wonderful to see everyone here this evening. It's wonderful to hear the Dharma Bums band. That's fantastic. And I see someone who's Stephen from Lowell Celebrates Kerouac. And just this fantastic team of people keeping the best of the beats alive. And of course, our king of good karma, David Amram, whom I've been lucky enough to have collaborated with now for 25 years on and off. And had it not been for David and his credibility getting behind this notion of the Kerouac House, which is this photograph right here. This is it. From Orlando, Florida. And what this was a rental house in a little neighborhood called College Park on the northwest edge of Orlando. And it had been a rental probably back to World War II. And that's why Jack moved in here in the summer of 1957. Around the back, this little back porch apartment here, $30 a month and no air conditioning. Tin roofed house. And it just, you talk about a hand to mouth existence. Here's somebody, you know, he called himself an unself-confident egomaniac, which I love, you know, because it's so true. I mean, he never stopped believing. He always plied his trade, and he wrote Dharma Bums in this house, or at least he put it all together on the teletype scroll in 11 days and nights in November and December of 1957. And it's very moving with all the tours we've given through the years and the very special people we've had here, including Carolyn Cassidy and Steve Allen and just great writers and artists through the years. He never stopped plying his trade. He never stopped believing in himself. And I think that's really the moving thing about this house. Was it represented his transformation from being this nomadic, twice divorced nobody from Lowell, Massachusetts, living here in the back porch with Gabrielle, my mare, his mother, to the bar to the beat generation. And that's the historic import of the house. And I brought along my book, Kerouac in Florida, Where the Road Ends. And my bookmark tonight is the letter from the state of Florida in 2013, putting it in the National Register of Historic Places. So,
yay, you.
Yeah.
So Bob, we have the video ready and queued up. And I just want to mention, just in case it gets missed, is how much Jack Kerouac loved that tree and would sleep outside under the tree from, you know, what I've read. And I just love that he loved that tree so much and that the tree is still there.
Thank God. Yeah, it's a beautiful oak. It's just like a granddaddy living thing, sort of protecting the little shotgun shack house. He used to crash out in this side yard quite a bit too, after riding all night. And you feel, I think David has a term for it or a phrase for it. You feel the vibrations of history in a place like this, because you sure do here, no doubt.
Wonderful. So would you like to introduce the edit of the intermission?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is the C-SPAN video. It was fantastic. And I mean, this was like 20 years ago that C-SPAN came when we first had this idea of doing a writer's retreat and interviewed us, and interviewed David is in there as well, to talk about the notion of why we were doing what we were doing. So this, for the intermission, is the C-SPAN coverage of the Jack Kerouac House in Orlando, Florida.
We'll show you that tomorrow at 1 p.m. Eastern.
It was just a usual Saturday night good time, nothing else. The bebop winos were wailing away. the working man tenors, the cats who worked and got their horns out of hock and blew and had their women troubles and came on in their horns with a will saying things, a lot to say, talkative horns. You could almost hear the words, and better than that, the harmony. Made you hear the way to fill up blank spaces of time with the tune and very consequence of your hands and breath and dead soul. Summer, August 1949, in Frisco, blowing mad. The dew and the muscat in the interior fields of Joaquin, and down in Watsonville, the lettuce blowing. The money flowing for Frisco, so seasonal and mad.
Jack Kerouac's On the Road brought him to national prominence in 1957. Before this notoriety, he lived with his mother in the College Park neighborhood of Orlando, Florida, where they rented the back room apartment of a small one-floor home there. Today, the home serves as the anchor of the Kerouac Writers and Residents Project of Orlando. We visited the site to learn about Jack Kerouac's time in Central Florida before and after the publication of On the Road and the role of the home today.
Jack Kerouac arrived in Orlando in December of 1956. He came here because his sister and her family had just moved here. Carolyn Blake's husband wanted to be part of the burgeoning space race and the technology explosion. Jack's mother wanted to be near her only daughter and grandson. And wherever she went, Jack would follow because he needed a place to crash after all of his travels. So that's how it started. Jack and his mother moved into the back porch apartment here in this home in July of 1957. At the time, he's basically a nobody, nomad writer from Lowell, Massachusetts. He's 35 years old. By the time he moves
There's
to home in April
sometimes
1950, he
delay on
becomes
Zoom.
a media darling before people know what that was. In October, he comes back to this house to escape the suffocating fame that he was not at all ready for. But once he gets back into this home, he's rejuvenated. Finally, he's vindicated to his family members. They can see a New York Times bestseller list with the name Jack Kerouac on it, and it's very invigorating. So he gets into this house. He writes a one-act play called The Beat Generation. He takes phone calls from major magazines. His agent is talking to Marlon Brando about perhaps bringing On the Road to the big screen. He writes these energetic letters to his girlfriend, Joyce Johnson, saying, I've got this brand new Royal typewriter, I've got a roll of teletype paper, I can just swing and swing like the improvisational jazz artists. He was very energized, so he's enjoying a very prolific period here. Then by the end of 57, he writes the Dharma Bums in this house. So it's a very prolific period when he's living here. And this house represents the transformation of Jack Kerouac from that nobody nomad writer to the bard of the beat generation in a relatively short amount of time. When you go into the back of this tiny little back porch apartment, it's very moving to see the hand-to-mouth conditions they must have been living at the time. You know, now it's nicely renovated and it looks very nice, but back then it was very meager. And he's living in this 10 by 10 room with a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling. He has his work table and all of his notebooks that he would write in spread out on the table, and he has the roll of teletype paper fed into his typewriter so, you know, he can type without interruption. He would work at night because it was so hot during the day in this tin-roofed cottage. And so I imagine the sound of that rapid-fire typing from this manual typewriter in the middle of the night spilling out onto the streets here in College Park.
He typed under this tree just to my left. That's where he used to come out when it was so hot. It was just hot as heck down here in the summer. And in fact, that's what got him to leave Orlando eventually, the heat. And he used to type right here. He'd take oranges from very nice neighbors that lived nearby and different citrus. And he'd play basketball at a couple of houses down the street that had basketball hoops. This young man named Don Jordan, at the time he was a teenager. And he bumped into a guy at Lake Adair just a few blocks from here back in the early 60s, late 50s. And they got to talking. And this gentleman was telling this young boy how he was more a musician than a writer, and that he was going to New York to work some more jazz gigs with his friend David Amram. And that was Jack Kerouac.
His writing style was natural. It came from his heart, it came from his feelings of the moment, and he always had that jazz rhythm. He could rap. We're out here in Lowell in the USA, and it's just one thing for C-SPAN I gotta say, the spontaneity is always look into your soul, and whatever you write and think is gonna come out whole. Well, that was the kind of thing that Jack and I would do for fun on the spot, not to win the Pulitzer Prize for bad poetry, but to free yourself as any improviser would do, so that when you were sitting down to write it down, whether you were writing a symphony, which I would do after playing a jazz gig all night, or you were writing a novel, which Jack would do after we'd been out rapping and playing and doing things ourselves, our minds would be free to dare to be creative, to take what he called the first thought as the best thought, and dare to put it down on paper.
Kerouac liked to approach writing like the athlete he used to be. He was a very accomplished football player, and he wanted to approach writing with that same sense of vigor. He said he typed fast because life on the road was fast. So he was very open about the fact that he took certain stimulants like Benzedrine. He said he needed alcohol to an extent to achieve an ecstasy of the mind, but he would write in these marathon sessions. For instance, the Dharma Bums was written in 11 days and nights here. Now, granted, he had sketched out much of the work in his little notebooks that he would keep with him, but this was the actual process of bringing it all into one work. So he would type very quickly. He would type during these marathon sessions, but he felt that's what he needed to create his spontaneous prose. He wanted to feel like the jazz musicians, where it was this sense of typing without interruption, because what came first, he felt, was what needed to go on paper and stay there.
Jack lived in many, many places during his lifetime. Orlando was one of them. And he told me one time, he said, you know, Davy, he said, it's good for my mother's health. The weather's good for my mother's health. And it was also peaceful enough where he could get some writing done, because at the time that On the Road came out, he was totally unknown. And even afterwards, people there weren't as aware of his celebrity as they were in other places. He had some peace, and he had good memories.
Part 2 coming right up.
So Bob, that's a beautiful piece. We're editing it down. We edited it down a little bit, and it's C-SPAN, so we have to jump to the next bit.
Terrific. Bravo.
The Jack Kerouac project was started by Bob Keeling and myself and my wife to try to increase interest in literature in Central Florida, and to put Central Florida on the national and even international arts map by letting people know that Jack Kerouac spent his most productive years in this house behind me here in College Park, in an area right outside downtown Orlando, Florida. The purpose is to do what Jack Kerouac wanted to do, which was create a writer's retreat. That was always his dream, and he intended to do it in Central Florida, and he was never able to. The story is that Jack Kerouac actually purchased land in Orlando that would be a retreat for his buddies and his friends and young writers to come down here and just write and just research, rest, relax, talk, chat. And because of the way his last 7 or 8 years were, he never got a chance to do that. He sold the property, and ironically, the property that he owned is now under Interstate 4 out here that runs east, west, north, south through downtown Orlando. And the second house that's here on the Kerouac property used to be on I-4, not the same property, but it was moved here in the early 60s. And that's it's a great feeling to know that we're doing what Jack Kerouac would have done had he lived. That's a wonderful feeling.
Jack Kerouac's relevance is that any young person who dreams of being a writer or a painter or a musician or a poet or a computer programmer or a surgeon or any kind of dream that they are told they are not qualified for, that they can do it. Because Jack came from a time in our society and from a background in American society of the 30s and the 40s, when he would have been told, as he was very often, you can't possibly be a writer. The kind of person you are, where you're from, the way you speak, the way you dress, the way you write, no one is interested in what you're writing about. And of course, Jack, as all great artists, spoke of his time. He was a reporter for his time.
I think generation to generation, Jack Kerouac's writing resonates with each new generation that discovers his work. Like nobody I've ever read, Kerouac captures the romance for the road, trying to drink in this beautiful landscape that is America, but yet at the same time, it's imbued with the sadness that comes with the limitations of our lives. But yet, that celebration of America is so palpable for the people who discover it for the first time. That celebration of the ordinary, or what seems ordinary. But when Kerouac writes about it, for some reason, it becomes extraordinary. Because he seems to be this innocent who is truly in love with this unfolding landscape he sees before him. The plains of Kansas, the cornfields of Nebraska, the abandoned train depots. He says, I wonder what Denver will be like. So it's like he's seeing America with a fresh set of eyes, and I think that appeals so strongly to the young people of America. And that's why, generation to generation, his work is still so relevant and so meaningful.
So Dean and I raced on to the East Coast. At one point, we drove a 1947 Cadillac limousine across the state of Nebraska at 110 miles an hour, beating hot-shot passenger trains and steel-wheel freights in one nervous, shuddering snap-up of the gas. We told stories and zoomed east. There were hobos by the tracks, wino bottles, the moon shining on wood fires. There were white-faced cows out in the plains, dim as nuns. There was dawn, Iowa, Mississippi River at Davenport, Chicago by nightfall. Oh, man, said Dean to me as we stood in front of a bar on North Clark Street in a hot summer night. Dig these old Chinamen that cut by Chicago. What a weird town.
Terrific.
Could have played all of it. It's an amazing piece.
Well, this is the time when I'm usually supposed to introduce, for those of you who turned in late, the person that you're seeing with the red dress and the gigantic bridge behind her, which we rented for the weekend, is Pamela Christensen, who created this program. Anthony Demarbiex, whom you don't see, but if he weren't here, we wouldn't be here either, is the miraculous person who somehow helps to put this together every week, in addition to his own work. And we have a wonderful James Canary, the person who's the keeper of the scroll, who came down to Orlando when Bob Keeling was there, when they first showed the Kerouac scroll and went on the road. Jim has been all over the world and still goes all over the world with the scroll. And of course, someone who looks just like Chris Felver, whom you can see in the screen, and Norton Wisdom, who's a terrific visual artist. But the young man that you see in the black jacket, at least that's what I see on my screen, is Bob Keeling. You've already seen him and heard him, and here he is. He's been introduced so many times, there's nothing more we can say except that we're so glad that you're here, and that all people who live in a small town anywhere, and New York City is another small town with just a lot of different neighborhoods making it a bigger town, which is why it's so wonderful. And every big city is a bunch of small towns, even if it's only a block per town. Orlando not only has now Disneyland, which is terrific, and all the other attractions of the great sports teams and the Whale Museum, Sea World, and all those terrific things. It also has the Kerouac Writers' Residence, which shows that any city in America of over 35 or 40 people can have its own person of distinction who's from that town to celebrate them or who has lived in that town, and that you don't have to go to New York or Los Angeles and live in a rat hole for 45 years to maybe get discovered for 2 weeks and then go back into the dungeon. You can do it all from wherever you live, and that's before the internet. Now with the internet, everyone is doing that, and that's a great thing. So that opens up the whole door for anyone and everyone. And when Bob Keeling wrote his first book about Kerouac in Florida, and I say this not to demean him because this book has a bunch of editions, no one at that time was interested in publishing it because it wasn't depressing, filthy, and inaccurate enough to whet the appetites of what the depraved people thought this low-life beatnik was about, and therefore they thought perhaps he was writing about the wrong person. I was honored to write the foreword to it, and that's what I'm as proud of being a tiny part of that book as I am for the own books that I've written and my own symphonies and all the other stuff I've done in my life, because Bob was telling the truth and is a professional reporter, and now he's asked to write books as a result of that great book, and he's written a book about the people who created the Tupperware, the extraordinary family that did that, and about Graham Parsons, one of the great musicians from Florida, and the Beatles in Florida. And I can
and Elvis.
So please,
Yes.
welcome. After that,
Thank you, David. Thank
he
you.
has time to speak for himself, Mr. Bob Keeling.
Well,
Hey, Bob,
thank you, Sir
welcome.
Dave. Thank you, Sir Dave. Thank you, Pamela. Thank you all. And one of the things that I would bristle at when I first moved down here in almost 30 years ago now was everyone going, oh, you're in Orlando. Oh, the plastic theme parks and, oh, strip malls. And of course, and but when I started going beneath the surface, you find all of these wonderful stories. Greg and Dwayne Allman are from Central Florida. Tom Petty, Bernie Ledden, the founder of the Eagles. You go on and on and on with all of these great artists. I mean, you could argue that in a way, Central Florida is the cradle of guitar rock with all of these, great artists coming from there. But it took my friend from Kansas City to tell me, hey, this was 25 years ago this month. Had you heard that Jack Kerouac, he either lived in Orlando or he died there? And I said, no, I hadn't heard anything about it at all. And I started researching the newspaper, and there was very little. And at the time, most of the conventional biographies, when they talked about Kerouac, oh, yeah, Florida, that's the place where he went to die. And, as I got more into it, it became apparent that, no, he actually went there to live. And, this humble little house right here is where his career was totally transformed. None of the biographies talked about it. They didn't talk about the books that were written here, Dharma bums in this house, as we'd mentioned earlier. And he has an amazing legacy in Florida. And really, it was his home away from home from 1956 until his death in 1969. But there's plenty to celebrate here. And over 25 years, that's what, David has come down so many times to do, to talk about, how things were good in Florida, how this, he becomes the bard of the Beat generation while here. On the Road was published while he's living in this house, and he becomes the literary Elvis of 1957. And, he goes up to New York, as David was talking about, and he and Joyce Johnson, they read the review in the New York Times, and then, oh my God, he's this media darling before anybody knows what that is. And finally, after 6 weeks of all that mayhem, he comes back here in his little back porch apartment to escape all that. But at the same time, now he can show his sister and brother-in-law, who kind of thought he was frivolous and made fun of him, a New York Times bestseller list with his name on it. And, now he's rejuvenated and he's getting all of these letters. There's a possibility Marlon Brando is going to play him in a film version of On the Road. And he's writing poems like Orlando Blues. He's writing Lucy in Midnight. As we mentioned, he's writing Dharma Bombs. So I would argue this was his last prolific period, was here in Orlando at the end of 57, going into early 1958. And it's been very, very satisfying to take what was a fire trap rental that it's amazing. Number one, it never burned down. And number two, that it was never turned into a Starbucks, because it's on this beautiful corner lot, this huge lot. And it's got another house behind there that is also on the property. But instead, grassroots people got together and raised enough money to buy this house, to renovate it. Then we got a grant from the state of Florida to just do the kind of work necessary to turn it into a writer's retreat. That's what it's been for 22 years. We've had basically a contest every year, and we invite writers and artists from all over the world to submit their work, and then 4 are chosen, 3 months at a time, 4 for a year, to live in this house rent-free and apply their trade, just like Kerouac did back then. And since that time in 1999, there's been upwards of 80 writers who've lived in this house rent-free to pursue their art and not have to worry about paying bills and, you know, the other minutia that can get in the way of your art. So that's the story of the little house in Orlando. And now when you go by it, there's one of those big, beautiful wrought iron Florida heritage signs in front of it. And an actor from New York was the one who ponied up the $2,000 to put that sign in the front of the yard. And we're just so grateful for that. And it's been an incredible journey. And, you know, when I asked Dave, you know, what do you think Kerouac would think of all this, you know? And he goes, oh, Jack would cry. I mean, this is exactly the kind of thing that he would like to be remembered by, you know, not lawsuits, not, you know, being a caricature of himself, but this little house where he plied his trade, where he never gave up. And then he finally saw success, for better or worse. Now other writers, other artists are encouraged to do the very same thing. And that actor, by the way, who put the sign in front of the house at his own expense, Michael Shannon, the great actor who didn't want any credit. I still to this day want to shake his hand and thank him for doing that. But that's the kind of devotion that this place inspires. So, and Dave, we couldn't have done it without you. We couldn't have done it without your credibility. We couldn't have done it without you reading that article. And, you know, Stephen, I was up there in 96 for Lowell Celebrates Kerouac, and John was still around. And, you know, the whole Sampras family just welcomed me in there. And to go to the house on 2 Stevens Street and, oh, yeah, here's one of Jack's manuscripts. And, you know, John was the one who told me where this house was. I couldn't find it. And finally, just for the hell of it, there's this great journalistic tool. I'll share the secret with everybody. It's called the phone book. I literally looked John up in the Lowell, Massachusetts phone book. His name was listed. And I told him, he answers the phone. You know, I don't know if you guys all had ever met John, but he had this great New England accent. And I was like, you know, John, I've been told that Kerouac lived in an apartment somewhere around here in College Park, but I can't find it. None of the biographies talk about it. And I'll never, ever forget this. This was 25 years ago this month that I made that call. And he goes, oh, yeah, well, hang on a minute. Jack kept a list of every place he ever lived, and I got it right here on the wall. And he looks at it and he says, let's see, summer of 57, that would be 1418 and a half Cloyes Street. That's what this is, 1418 Clouser Avenue. And the half is the little back porch apartment, which it was just a hovel. But it was so cool, like to, you know, when the Kerouac Omnibus came out in 95, you'd see notes and letters to Gary Snyder, and then notes back from Gary to Jack in 1418 and a half Clouser. So as a historian, you knew, hey, that's confirmation that Jack lived there. And then as I started putting all the pieces together, it's like, my God, not only did he live there, this is where his whole career was transformed, even though he didn't live there for all that long a time. But that's what makes it so moving and so interesting. And it really has become a historic and cultural touchstone here in Orlando. And we're so proud to, have that here as something real. And, for people to go back in the best tradition of the Beats, like David, where you are encouraged to express yourself, everyone is included. You don't have to be some stuffy professor from a college to get up and give a high-minded speech. And the inclusiveness, the grassroots nature of this is what, makes it so beautiful. This isn't, they didn't cut a check from McDonald's and give us the money. It was done incrementally, and that's what's so satisfying about it. So that's a little bit of a background on the Kerouac House in Orlando. Now, the city of Orlando's only literary landmark, as a tribute to Jack, for never forgetting who he was, never giving up on his dream to be a writer. And then it finally paid off here.
And I guess you could say, Bob, the next one will probably be for Zora Neale Hurston, who lived nearby, was brought up right close to the city of Orlando. And there's a tiny park in St. Augustine, Florida, where she also lived. And now she's being discovered or rediscovered. And that's the amazing part of our culture, that it's already there. So
Yeah.
when you said about the phone book, I just want to pass on what Dizzy Gillespie told me. He said, I was with him playing at the Village Gate. He gave out his card with his phone number, his home address. I said, that's incredible, man. He said, look, I came here with Cab Calloway when I was in this band. He said, Pablo, said the great Andres Segovia, the baddest, meaning in the vernacular, the best guitar.
Yeah.
He was the baddest cat on the guitar ever. I just looked up in the phone book, and sure enough, he was listed in the phone book.
Oh, yeah.
I said, man, if Segovia is listed in the phone book, he said, I'll give anybody my number. He said, I don't owe anybody any money. I'm too.
Kerouac was listed in the
so
St.
open.
Pete. Kerouac, long after he died, John Sampas kept Kerouac's number listed in the St. Petersburg phone book, kind of for the same reason. I asked John, what do you do that? And he's like, well, I do that in a way because in that way, he's still with us.
I think also, without being snobbish, the people who are open like that, generally people who want something, after 35 seconds change their deportment because they're with somebody who's not into that world of hustling, bustling, and dishonest. So they become part of a different level. And without sounding super snobbish, the people who need 5 bodyguards, a lawyer, a battery of people to protect them, don't usually have the chops. That's also vernacular for me, the technical ability to articulate, whether it's writing a book, playing a horn, conducting a symphony, or practicing a lawsuit, whatever it is. If they don't have the chops, they need all that other stuff. And that's not disparaging those people who want to be super private. But basically, everybody's brought up to believe if someone's really good, I can't talk to them because they think I'm a subhuman creep. And the beautiful thing about Jack was he hung out with anybody and everybody. And while he might have been taken advantage of, he had a much fuller life and magnificent books that he wrote because he was always writing about and for others and always fostering creativity in others. And you don't have to join a cult or have a guru with a limo or a dope salesman to be able to accomplish that spiritual level. You just have to be aware that it's there and then try to hook up with it.
Hey, David, you brought up a great point about Jack being willing to talk to anybody. And what I have here is from my book, Kerouac in Florida. I've got this little vignette of this lady I met the first time I came to this house 25 years ago. And there's a legacy here, and there's kind of a really neat surprise that goes back to Kerouac's time there. Would it be okay if I read a short passage from the book?
Yes.
Okay, this chapter is called A Good Neighbor, all right? And the lady I'm going in to meet is the woman living in the Kerouac house when it was this dilapidated fire trap 25 years ago. So it's a short passage, but it goes right to what David is saying, that Kerouac would easily connect with people. They didn't have to be a certain status. And it left behind a very unique legacy that I was able to discover this day I went and met this lady. So this isn't too long, but it gives the spirit of the house. I've made countless visits to the little house on Clouser Avenue, and one of the very first stands out in my memory. It's mid-Saturday morning. A heavy blanket of fog envelops all sense of time. The thick mist adds a dreamlike quality to the sleepy morning as I head for Jack and Mamera's former back porch apartment. Across Lake Adair, the ducks drift somewhere on the water, but could just as easily be floating in midair. Louis Armstrong's gravel yet velvet voice wafts from a jazz station I've discovered on the car radio. I'm not even going to try to sing this, Dave, but I can hear you doing it. Give me a kiss to build a dream of. That's as good as I can do. I think of how Jack Kerouac loved the great jazz artists, and the past lingers a bit nearer in this otherworldly cocoon. I arrive and walk around the back of the tiny back porch apartment. I find a woman named Carol Ney and her husband, John, sitting amidst the bric-a-brac in the place they call home. Squirrels scamper in and out the back door for a handout. John sits in a straight back chair, a blanket covering his legs. His hair is bushy and gray, and peppery whiskers dot his aged face. John's eyes look very tired, and his hearing's gone bad. But he asks if I'm interested in a cigar. I rode the rails all across the country, he tells me. I was a hobo for years. It seems only fitting that he lives in the same place where Kerouac wrote his homage to roadmen like John. Carol calls herself a retired antiques dealer, but judging from the clutter, I'd say she's having a hard time staying in retirement. There are scores of magazines lining old storage shelves. There's an old picture of John from bygone days and trips on the road. I take a seat in this cramped hovel, and Carol begins to tell me how she used to cut out articles about Jack Kerouac when she ran across them in magazines. Now she tells me, she goes, my neighbor Rose McCrae knew him when he lived here. Carol recalls while lounging on her little bed and lighting a cigarette. Exhausted from long nights of writing, Kerouac often crashed in the side yard during the day. From her house across the street, Rose McCrae often heard his rapid-fire typing. And intrigued by the idea of having a writer in the neighborhood, McCrae wasn't shy about striking up a conversation with him. So this is Carol recounting this to me. She goes, now he told her he was about to get a book he'd written years ago, published, Carol remembered. And when it came out, he said he'd send her a copy. And then I'll never forget this moment. I will never forget this moment. She goes, oh, by the way, he did make good on that promise. Would you like to see it? And I said, see what? Well, she goes, amidst all of the clutter was this hidden treasure, a gift from Rose McCrae that she gave to Carol before she died of cancer. Sitting with her legs together on the tiny sofa bed, her gray hair pulled back in a ponytail, Carol casually reaches into a hidden place and pulls out a Ziploc bag. You have to, with all the bugs around here, you have to have it in a bag, she states with an air of pragmatism. And when she removes what's inside and hands it to me, my heart jumps. It's a first edition copy of On the Road. The dark blue cover features a small abstract design in blue and pink. The dust jacket is frayed at the ends of the spine. The front and back covers are somewhat bent and worn. I open the book and the 1957 price catches my eye, $3.95. On the right-hand side, another surprise, this handwritten inscription from Kerouac himself. To Mrs. McCrae, my good neighbor, Jack Kerouac. Years ago, Carol saw an article that put the value of a signed first edition hardcover of On the Road at $650. Now, I told her, Carol, it's worth considerably more than that today. Once Carol said she offered to return the gift to her neighbor, but Rose wouldn't hear of it. No, I gave it to you, McCrae said, and I want you to keep it. And it's the kind of thing you might expect a good neighbor to say. Now, I've always thought, had I been a carpetbagger, I probably could have said, okay, here's your $650, Carol. Well, I'll go ahead and take that book off your hands, but of course I wouldn't. And as a postscript, she did end up selling that book for $14,000 to pay for her husband's funeral. So, in a way, Jack took care of them. But I think it gives you an idea of what his life was like back then, and plying his trade in the middle of the night because it was so god awful hot. And that's why, photographs like this one are so important, because before we started finding out about the Orlando years, all you would read about was St. Petersburg, where Jack moved later on in his life when, the alcoholism really accelerated. And unfortunately, the pictures of him back then weren't very good, and they weren't very flattering for a man who was still only in his mid-40s. But one of the greatest discoveries that I was lucky enough to make was I saw a review of one of Kerouac's book in Time magazine it was a 1958 issue. And it had a tiny little name down at the bottom, the guy who had taken a picture to accompany the article. And the guy's name was Fred DeWitt. And here's a picture of Fred from the book. And again, I took this incredible journalistic tool, the phone book, called the guy up. Not only is he still alive, he's still in Orlando, he lives a block from where I worked. And I said, wow, this is so great to talk to you, Fred. Can you tell me about this shoot you did with Kerouac? And he goes, I said, God, you met Jack Kerouac. That's amazing. And he goes, Jack who? He didn't remember it. He had never even seen the pictures that he shot and then just sent off to be developed to be part of that freelance article. And so I contacted Time magazine to see if they might have any of these treasured pictures. And they got back to me and they said, no, we don't have the negatives, but we do have the contact sheet if you'd like to see them. And so this was 2001. And I'm sitting at my desk the day the link arrived to the contact sheets. And the first picture that I clicked on was this one. Let me see if you can see this. There it is. It's Jack looking straight at the camera. And it's if he's saying, what took you so damn long? But there's Jack sitting at his desk. This was when he was typing Dharma Bums from the scroll into a manuscript to send to his publishers. And this was 1958. And that was just another great discovery from the book, because all of these pictures included Kerouac being engaged with his notebooks that he, of course, would use to write all his books while he was on the road. And then he would come back and put them into the scroll form. But I think they're unique to Fred DeWitt in the sense that there had never been a complete photo essay of Jack actually writing one of his books as taken by a photographer. So the Fred DeWitt pictures are posted in my book for the first time. These pictures from 1958, and you see Jack typing by the light of a naked, one bulb there in his little, probably 12 by 12 bedroom at the Kerouac house. And it was just a great discovery. And just thinking about all of that now really brings back a lot of great memories. So
it's extraordinary that you went on that journey to find those photos, and we have the vid you sent us.
Oh, great. Okay.
And Fred DeWitt, if you've got that ready, Anthony.
Yeah. Do you want me to intro it?
Yes, please.
Okay. So I worked at a TV station back then, and in between car wrecks and murders and stabbings and God knows what else, to their credit, they allowed me to do a 5-minute piece on Fred DeWitt's lost images that we found. And we took Fred to the photo studio so he could see his photos again for the first time. And this is one of, from being in news for 32 years, this is one of maybe 3 pieces I'm the most proud of. So I hope you'll take a look at it. It's called Lost Images Found, Kerouac in Orlando. It's about 5 minutes long.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Ready to roll, Anthony.
Channel 2 has learned that an American treasure is coming to Central Florida in January. Manuscript of author Jack Kerouac's 1957 classic.
Yeah, sometimes there's delay.
Okay.
On the Road is going to be on exhibit at the Orange County Regional History Center.
In 2001, that manuscript sold for $2.4 million, the most ever paid for a literary manuscript. For the first time, we want to share with you our own historic find, a long-lost photo shoot with the exclusive Kerouac while he lived here in Orlando. News Channel 2's Bob Keeling reports.
Jack Kerouac.
After all the lean years, in 1957, Jack Kerouac's novel On the Road launched the struggling writer to stardom as if tied to the Sputnik satellite.
The evening star must be drooping and shedding her sparkler dims on the prairie.
In long paragraphs bursting with energy and colorful characters, On the Road immortalized the wanderers that Kerouac met along America's highways. Years before his #1 hit, Mr. Tambourine Man,
kind of Kerouac-like,
legendary folk rocker Roger McGuinn says he and other aspiring artists devoured Kerouac's book like a Bible.
Kind of a rebellion, similar to what rock and roll was, where they were rebelling against sort of Eisenhower's society, the very kind of square, straight, middle-class mentality that America had developed.
The New York Times compared Kerouac to Hemingway. On the Road was a bestseller sensation.
And he was a big star, and it actually wasn't easy for him. He didn't handle that well.
To make things worse, some critics found Kerouac's tribute to drifters threatening and un-American. To get out of the glare, Kerouac retreated to his mother's back porch apartment in Orlando.
It was much cussed and discussed.
In the 1950s, Jean Yothers wrote features for the Orlando Sentinel. She interviewed a young Elvis. But when she came here to interview America's literary king, Kerouac couldn't even come to the door.
I was kind of shocked to think that here it was mid-afternoon and he was sleeping off a drunk.
I always said no one would ever look for him in this family neighborhood.
In the 2 years she lived across the street from Jack Kerouac, former neighbor Audrey Redding says he kept his distance and rarely came out during the day. But one memory sticks out.
He was, as I say, paddling down the street in his sandals with a duffel bag, no car. And when his mother came over, she said he was hitchhiking to Mexico.
This was the driveway, actually.
One of those who did get closer was Fred DeWitt. In 1958, Time magazine assigned him to shoot Kerouac for an article.
We talked about a lot of stuff, just very, very nice guy.
After the photo shoot, DeWitt mailed the negatives to Time. In its February 1958 issue, just one of DeWitt's pictures was published.
The only one I ever saw was the one that was published in the magazine.
For history's sake, DeWitt decided to track down the rest of his historic images. The shoot Fred DeWitt shot and forgot. For 45 years, the small contact sheet images remained in Time's archive, some marked in grease pencil by the magazine's editors.
There you go.
We brought the sheets to digital photography expert Joe Brooks.
Most of them weren't too bad, except where all the magic marker was and all that kind of stuff, because then you have to rebuild the places where the marker went over.
That's great.
Fred DeWitt watches as his decades-old images of Jack Kerouac become new again.
To see these come alive, it really stand. You can't see it with my long sleeve shirt, but it's standing the hair up with my arms a little bit.
It was in this 10 by 10 room that DeWitt captured Kerouac at a simple wooden desk.
That's a fantastic
Road is part of Professor Ernest Smith's English curriculum. He sees historical value in DeWitt's photos.
to see that this man lived here, worked here, and that we now recognize that he was here for a crucial period of his career, I think could again serve as an inspiration to some of our own young people.
The images give us a glimpse at how Kerouac's books were born. When he was traveling, Kerouac wrote in notebooks he could fit in a shirt pocket. On a manual typewriter, he put it all together on long scrolls of teletype paper.
I don't want to change my narrative thought. I keep going.
For days at a time, he worked at a frenzied pace without having to change paper. And when a manuscript was complete, he retyped it in conventional book form.
And it really brought me right back into the time. It was quite an experience.
At the height of Kerouac's fame, DeWitt captured history on a January day and sent it away. During his Orlando years, Jack Kerouac, until his death in 1969, he lived middle class and never had much money in the bank. Jack Kerouac died of alcoholism at age 47. But since then, the value of Kerouac's estate has grown to more than $20 million. $20 million. His literary legacy is just as rich.
This is a treasure. This is great. I'm happy to see this, and as an Orlando resident, I'm proud of it.
Let's make an 8 by 10 for Fred, for old time's sake.
In these lost images now found, Jack Kerouac is 35 forever, ducking fame in Orlando, pursuing his passion in a 3-room back porch apartment. I'm Bob Keeling, News Channel 2.
That's beautiful archives. And we just saw the scroll. Can we, Bob, say hello to Jim Canary?
Oh, with pleasure, with pleasure.
He's the preservationist, archivist.
Hey, Bob.
Jim, good to see you again.
Yeah, that was great.
Oh, thanks.
I wondered about the photos.
About which one?
I was wondering about those photos, the story of them. That's great to be able to see the whole documentation of that. So I have a question. I have 2 questions for you. What was his cat's name?
Oh my God. I don't think I ever, yes, I actually did. Tommy was one of them.
Okay.
I think it was Timmy and Tommy, because he lamented when they moved back to Orlando in 61 and 62. They lived out by the horse track, and he wrote about one of them passing away. He was very close to those cats.
Oh, yeah. Oh, it's beautiful to see him with a cat.
Yeah.
My other question is, did you, before the Dharma Bum scroll was sold at Christie's, were you able to ever see it?
No.
Okay.
No, and I would have loved to have. You know, we ended up acquiring the conventional manuscript of the Dharma Bums that he sent off to be published. You know,
Right.
the Kerouac project did. Never saw the scroll. I would have loved to have seen that.
Yeah, because on the road, I don't think it's on teletype paper, and this one I think may indeed be on teletype paper. On the Road was on 8 sheets of paper taped together, and I just was wondering if this was also pieced or if he just went continuous all the way through.
I seem to remember, because you're right, Jim, that it's a different kind of paper this time around, and I remember specifically them saying that this one was teletype paper, and I would imagine it was advantageous to do it that way, because then he didn't have to change paper at all.
Yeah.
And he didn't have to risk that it might get, jammed where you get a taped part. I know there was a Big Sur scroll too that he produced in Orlando in, I think, 61. Mm-hmm. And I haven't seen that one either. James, I want to pay tribute to Mr. Irsay right here and now for buying the On the Road scroll. And, he could have just stuffed it in a safe and, just put it away like some others have with some of other, Kerouac memorabilia they bought, but not Mr. Irsay. He made a point of taking that scroll literally on the road. And as I told you, before, seeing you unroll that manuscript into the long jewel case here in Orlando in 2004 was one of the most emotional moments for me and for a lot of us who knew what Kerouac had been through and how miserable he was, in many cases, before he saw some success. And to see it, be rolled into that case like, the masterpiece it is, the literary treasure it is, for all of America, for the world, was an amazing experience. And I've got to believe that has to be some experience for you to be trusted to do that time and time again.
Oh yeah, I mean, that's probably one of the greatest things that's ever happened in my life. It's actually changed my life in so many ways. Being able to meet people like David and yourself, and just so many people, Steve, all the people that are connected with Jack and have some part to play in keeping that alive. And Jim, as you say, has just been amazing with his support of all the activities going along with preserving the scroll and getting it out there, creating happenings all around it wherever it goes.
Well, the very first time was in Orlando. That was the first time that it was shown, and I remember all the times when I was in London, with other times with Jim Canary, who's the conservator of the scroll. That's the person who takes care of it to make sure it doesn't rot away or get mildew or wiped or torn up. And every time I've been lucky enough to be there for whatever the event was, seeing that laid out and seeing people come up to him and Jim speaking to them and not saying, "Get out of my face, you're an important worldwide figure, you can't do me any good." I don't disrespect people who are brought up that way, because that's the best they can do. But there's another way of behaving, and since Jack was all about not behaving that way, it's wonderful that James Irsay felt that, and that he got someone like Jim Canary not only to be a great conservator and a master at that, but to also be a gentleman and someone who loves Kerouac and, like all of us, appreciates what he gave to us as a gift so that we could try to be creative ourselves. That's a heck of a thing. So anybody gets a chance to see that scroll, you'll enjoy it. And if you go up to Jim Canary and ask him a question, he'll give you a better answer than you'd ever dream of.
Absolutely. And, David, I'm curious, what was your reaction when you saw it the first time laid out like that? You knew Jack when he was, still struggling, and a lot of people, what Truman Capote said, "Oh, it's not writing, it's typing." And then these years later, you're here to be able to pay tribute to it, as it's laid out like the masterpiece it is. How did that strike you?
Like when I went to the pyramids, I finally got to Egypt, and I said, "Oh boy." I went there and I thought I was going to play the flute, and I looked up and whoa. I never had a feeling like that in my life, which made me realize it's bigger than us. It's a mystery. Don't mess with it. Just honor it. And I looked at that scroll being laid out, and I just said, wow, it seemed like it was glowing. And I felt like I was up there in space, like the pictures of the space cadets looking down at the Earth. I said, man, I never had an experience like that. And I knew the book, and I knew him, and this was something else.
It really is.
It doesn't matter what I thought it was, because it is.
Yeah, and I think that brings up a good point about just the gravity of it. And Jim, one thing I was curious about is, were you trained? I mean, did anyone teach you how to lay it out like that? I mean, how did you decide this is how we're going to do it?
Jim's daughter was going to school up in Skidmore, and they had an art museum up there, and they had a couple of really innovative guys who were the prep people in the museum, put together all of their exhibits, and they put together, had an idea to design a case for it. It's modular, and it can be put together in 12-foot increments. And they had some extruded aluminum pieces put together. And so we worked back and forth. They would send me photos and drawings, and then I would make suggestions. And I think it's a brilliant idea for a modular case. I I don't know that anybody's ever made an exhibit case 120 feet long before.
Out of necessity. How far and wide have you taken that now?
Oh, it's been all over Europe. It went to Rome, was the first place, and then London, two stops in Ireland, 2 stops in Paris, 1 stop in Germany. Yeah.
Autry Museum.
Yeah, in this
Angela-
country, it's been all over.
Where's
Can
the
I
home
ask
for
you a
it now,
question?
by the way? I'm curious. Sorry, Pam. I was just curious.
it's
Where do
okay.
you keep it now?
Jim keeps it.
Oh, wow.
It's top secret.
I don't blame him.
When we first started working with him, we kept it at the Lily in between times. We kind of helped him with ideas on how to vet the venues, where to find libraries and museums that would be able to handle something like this. And he had a woman working with him, Myra Borshoff, who was just great to work with. And we worked for years putting the tour together. And Myra's no longer doing that, so I've taken over the responsibilities of anything to do with the scroll and some of his other collectibles.
Which are many.
Many.
James,
And varied.
I'd love to bust in with the question of, when I saw the scroll at the Autry, there was an amazing thing which you could use a scroll pad and see up above, like on an iPad or something.
We did
How
that.
did that come about? Mhm.
Well, I was afraid, here we're traveling it all over, and what if something should happen? What if a plane went down? And there it is, the only record we have of this that's in, New York Public did a digital version of it years ago, but the technology has improved so much. And we have a cruise scanner in Indianapolis. It's a 5-foot by 8-foot scanner that can do incredible work. And so we closed down their operation for 12 hours and had security, and we scanned it. It took 12 hours to scan the entire piece. And so that gave us a digital file that we could use in areas where they only could show a short section. We could scroll it on a screen, which they did there.
It's amazing. James, do you have something you want to read today?
Yeah, you said a selection from the Dharma Bums. This is one of my most influential books. It's how I got introduced to Kerouac before on the road. And I got very interested in the main character. Well, one of the main characters, Jaffe Ryder, who was a fantastic writer and poet himself, Gary Snyder from the San Francisco area, Bay Area. So he really shared a lot of experiences, and Jack shared a lot of experiences with him on Buddhism and on nature. And this is just a short section about making a cup of tea. Yeah, man, to me, a mountain is a Buddha. Think of the patience, hundreds of thousands of years just sitting there being perfectly, perfectly silent. And like praying for us all living creatures in that silence, and just waiting for us to stop all our fretting and fooling. Jaffe got out the tea, Chinese tea, and sprinkled some in a tin pot and had the fire going. Meanwhile, a small one to begin with, the sun was still on us, and then stuck a long stick tight down under a few big rocks and made himself something to hang the teapot on. And pretty soon the water was boiling, and he poured it out, steaming into the tin pot, and we had cups of tea with our tin cups. I myself had gotten the water from the stream, which was cold and pure like snow, and the crystal-lidded eyes of heaven. Therefore, the tea was by far the most pure and thirst-quenching tea I ever drank in all my life. It made you want to drink more and more. It actually quenched your thirst, and of course, it swam around hot in your belly. Now you understand the Oriental passion for tea, said Jaffe. Remember that book I told you about? The first sip is joy, the second is gladness, the third is serenity, the fourth is madness, the fifth is ecstasy.
Beautiful. Could I make a request, Pamela? We have someone all the way from Ireland. For those of you on the map, that's west of New Jersey, and not part of the Eastern Seaboard Establishment of Literature, but music, art, poetry are worldwide, universal, and probably outer spatial. Anyway, he's all the way over there in Dublin, in the freezing night on Zoom, I hope, if he could get through. He's going to be our special guest for next week, talking about the Irish writers and how the life that they live, where you're a poet, not by having a PhD in poetry and 15 connections and calling cards and a brochure, but by getting up at a pub, and if you can read a poem and have it go over, he's a poet or she's a poet. And that's a beautiful thing about Irish Celtic culture, called keeping it for real. And Brian Fleming, are you there somehow through the magic of technology?
He can probably hear you, Davey.
Is he there? Brian, are you there?
I can hear you all right, Davey. Yeah.
Could we see you just so you can wave hi to everybody and they'll know that you're here, you're a real person, and you'll be coming all the way from the fire next week to grace us with your presence.
There you go. The image isn't great because I've got to keep it quiet around here at this time of night. It's 2 in the morning, nearly 3:45 in the morning now.
Hey.
We had Larry Kerwin come on, who's from Ireland, but he came from New York. But Brian's nice enough to come all the way from Ireland. He's one of the great baron players, the traditional Irish drum, and can play jazz and blues and everything else of it. And an example of how Jack's lyrics and the spirit of collaboration with him is something that's universal and all around the world. So
yes, it's great to see you, Brian. We're going to be with you so much next week. I'll let you speak for a second, but we're going to go to a video of the Dharma Bums. We also have on this show today, Paul Carey, who's an extended member of the Dharma Bums. And this is at the Beat Museum with Jerry Cimino and a beloved beat entrepreneur, Al Hinkle.
Mm-hmm.
Is it playing? Is it paused?
Oh, could
Looks
I
like
interrupt you? Al Hinkle is an entrepreneur. Al Hinkle is a friend of Jack's.
Kerouac's 90th birthday here in San Francisco. And we have a lot of great items and things that are going to be happening tonight. One of the things we'll be doing is my great friend Al Hinkle is going to be talking to us soon. He'll be reminiscing about his time with both Neil and Jack.
On the road.
Especially Jack. Today's Jack's, or tomorrow actually, is Jack's birthday, so Al will be talking a lot about Jack, although he knew Neil Cassidy when they were young boys. Can I tell you one story about the... Oh, sure. Dig this, you guys. This is such a metaphor for life, because Al was a great friend of Neil's until the day Neil died. And when they were young boys, they would meet together at various places in Denver, and they'd hang out together. And Neil got into a few jams, as I think we all know. And Al's the guy that got Neil the job on the railroad. Al's the guy that helped Neil and his family when they were here in the Bay Area. And Neil was in prison. And Al was there to help him take care of the family, make sure that everything got taken care of the way it needed to. So he was always supporting and catching Neil and helping him when he was in trouble. And the most interesting thing for me as I got to know Al and his story is that when they were young boys, they would do a lot of gymnastic work in school. YMCA. Right, okay, YMCA. They would, and so they would do the trapeze. And Neil was nimble, and Neil was very able to get around. And Al was a bigger young man, so Al would be the catcher on the trapeze, and Neil. So I love that metaphor for their friendship, basically. And so we're going to be hearing a lot of those stories. But for now, I think Phil and the boys are going to be spending a little time, and girls, ladies. I apologize. And they're going to pick a little bit, and then we'll hear from Al.
I'm going to go grab my camera. I'll be right back.
Short version.
Oh, Davey, that's, as you know, the Dharma Bums. You've played with them a lot in all of your tours, and we have Paul Carey's on with us. He was on the left at the beginning of the vid. If you unmic yourself, I'd love to say hello to you.
Hi. Yeah, I'm a late comer to the Dharma Bums. The band was formed in the 70s, and Phil, a bit of a Buddhist scholar, the right songwriter and whatnot. And I got a call in 2009. Phil had been given my name by Win Paris, by the way, Pamela.
Thank you.
For a bass player, they were headed for Germany. There was 4 days of the Dalai Lama's teachings to be held at Frankfurt Stadium. And on the Saturday night, there was a big concert that was called Two Songs for the Dalai Lama. And there was a whole bunch of acts. And we closed the show that night. But it's kind of funny because when I'm asked who's the band, who are the Dharma Bums, I have always referred to them as a collection of 108 musicians worldwide, any number spread throughout the world, any number of which may gather at a point to become the Dharma Bums band. They would just pick it up. And I toured for a decade with Phil up and down California and whatnot. But I got on a plane at my own expense, having attended many of the Dalai Lama's teachings, or a few of the Dalai Lama's teachings. I wouldn't miss the opportunity to have a room in the Kempinski Hotel, which is like where Obama would stay when he was in Frankfurt. It's the only Frankfurt that had a security for the Dalai Lama. So I jumped at the chance, and it was absolutely a wonderful experience. The Dharma Bums have a Facebook page, and I could drop it in right now. On that is a tune from on the page, which I have queued up and can roll right now for you guys, was one of the songs that we played, Two Songs for the Dalai Lama, in Frankfurt, Germany in 2009.
Can I mention one thing? That's terrific, because the new generation has to do what they feel, and that's a beautiful thing. In the Beat Museum, which we saw a picture of, Al Hinkle was not an entrepreneur. He was a friend of Kerouac's and Cassidy. Right. The person who was doing all the speaking was the entrepreneur, Jerry, bless his heart, Jerry Cimino, who's keeping that somehow going. And for those of you who hear all the other music, which is great, just remember Charlie Parker's favorite musicians were Bach, Beethoven, Mozart, and Bela Bartok and Duke Ellington and Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie, and Thelonious Monk, and old country singers. So he loved folk music and French Canadian music. The only reason I mention that is that now when Kerouac became fashionable and the vestigial remains of the rock and roll industry thought they would glom on, that's cool too. But let's not confuse Jack Kerouac and what he loved, which was excellence and beauty, spontaneity, with anything else but that. And there are people who play every genre of music, including electronic music, and rappers who feel that as well. But it wasn't about any particular one genre. And Kerouac loved everyone from Beowulf up to people on the street. And I only mention that because now when he's finally acceptable, people always try to figure, well, what used to be vomititious is now acceptable. They try to make it relevant by putrefying it. And that's not anybody's fault. That's just the nature of our society. So it's always good to go back to the sources, get the remaining primary sources, and then you can appreciate everybody who's added their touch to what he loved and he did. That goes in music, literature, art, and life.
If you've got time go ahead. Go ahead. I wanted to jump in the conversation, but I don't want to interrupt.
Yeah, let's have Steve jump in. And I would say, Paul, gosh, if we had more time, I'd love to play that, but we don't have much more time. So thank you for coming on with us. And love to hear. Bob has had the Dharma Bums. And
I'd like to hear it too, Paul. I wasn't.
I will drop.
We could play it at the very end and just go longer if you'd like, David.
Or I'll just put the link in the chat, and you can click on it from there and watch it at your
Tell us how we can watch it on YouTube. Then we can see the whole thing without interruption.
If you want to, we can, David.
Yeah, you can just put it on, and then we can watch it over and over and tell our friends, and you won't be cut off.
Steve, did you first have a comment?
Well, just real quick, I want to tell my quick Al Hinkle story, which connects with Bob talking about his seeing it on the road. I had the pleasure of knowing Al about the last 10, 12 years of his life, spent a fair amount of time with him at his home in San Jose, where he's living with his daughter. And the very first time I visited with him, I did a series of interviews with him for a Beat Scene magazine article I did. But anyhow, the first time I visited him, we were chatting, and he says, I got something to show you. And he goes in and he brings out a first edition, first signed of The Town and the City. And he hands it to me, and I opened it up, and I can't remember the whole inscription, but it just says, to my old buddy of the roads, Al Hinkle, and his beautiful wife, Helen. And then he had a few more things written, I dedicate this book, Jack Kerouac, and signed it. My hands were shaking when I held that. I could have been holding the Gutenberg Bible, and it wouldn't have made any more effect upon me than that did. Bob, it's great to connect with you even over this time. But yeah, when Al handed me that book and I read that inscription, I really did. My hands just shook with it. One quick thing, Bob, greetings from Lowell. We were very pleased to have Eric Deckers up with us, one of your writers in residence a couple of years ago, to share his stories about being one of your writers in residence down there. Hope to see you again. I'm done for tonight. All right.
That's a great story.
And I want to say hello to Robert Heyman, a brilliant photographer friend of mine has come on. He's from Florida, actually, but I don't know what region of Florida. So hello, Florida people.
We're good people. That's Florida people.
Yay, Florida.
There he is.
I'm from Naples, by the way.
Oh, nice.
Mm-hmm. This is all very fascinating to me. I'm not really familiar with the work of Jack Kerouac, and so, but I wanted to investigate this, and I'm finding it truly fascinating. I'm really very interesting. I'm so glad I joined.
Thank you, Robert.
Sure.
And they have Florida's oldest alligator, because when I was a little boy, I knew the former.
The pride of Paso Grill.
When I went to the first grade in Paso Grill in 1937, a few months ago, but Alligator Joe was after my time. He lived to be 50-some years old, I think. And they also have a wonderful chamber orchestra there and an art museum. And you can go out to the Ding Dong National Park, the hippest open park in the world, and see wildlife. God bless the person who gave that to the world rather than make it into a gigantic food franchise. It's 17 miles of completely
Amen to that.
Amen. I'm going to say amen also to Norton Wisdom's painting. Can we go to you, Norton? I see some, it looks like Allen Ginsberg right there.
I want to see it.
What you got, Norton? Are you going to unmic yourself? That is fantastic. Well, we're all sitting here. This is what's going on. Who's in the cup? Tell us about those cups, Norton.
That's my Valentine's card to you, Pamela.
I love
Anyway,
you, Norton.
What a great session tonight. Good stuff, as always.
Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for the journey, everyone.
Thanks, Norton.
Love the artwork.
Could we see that painting again, Norton? Because you
Just
flashed
got a quick, I got a quick look.
That's a bliss face. Gosh, it looks photoreal on the eyes. That's going to be
I
squeegeed
thought it was
away.
a photograph.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Norton has performed with just the Doors, the just. Where are we going to go with the litany of Norton's achievements? The Pink Floyd,
Another Florida guy, Jim Morrison, had to stick that in there too.
Okay, there you go. All connected. We're all connected, right, Davey?
And Fred Neil.
The great Fred Neil.
The songwriters of the century. And also Carlisle Floyd, who wrote the best, I think the best, he and Gershwin's Porgy and Bess are the two greatest American operas that get played all over the world. And Carlisle Floyd stayed in the South after he did Susanna and became a worldwide appreciated figure. Instead of going to a big conservatory in New York City and rotting away, he said, man, I'm from Florida. I'm going to stay in the South. And he taught at LSU for 30 years. And I believe he's still alive and writes up a storm. And there's so many painters and poets and musicians, as well as the ones in Denver, Colorado, and Lowell, Massachusetts, and Pittsburgh, and Chicago, and Detroit, and Philadelphia, even New York City, and the environs, everywhere. Artists are everywhere. And that's the thing that Jack would have loved. And I want to hear the Dharma Bums whole thing. I hope that's put up on TV, on YouTube, so we can see it quietly and hear what a new generation feels about all that music. And also to thank Jerry Cimino for putting in part of that. His Beat Museum is a place where people can come and express themselves, and you don't need a PhD in order to come there. It's a blessing. And hopefully we can have ones like that, like the Kerouac Writers Residence and the Lowell Celebrates Kerouac, and what they do for Woody Guthrie and Okema, and all Farm Aid, all these great things I'm blessed to be part of, all are to celebrate what's beautiful and meaningful from the heart for others in America. And there's a lot of stuff like that. And Jack Kerouac was all about that. So we have to remember that and never allow merchandisers to putrefy what his legacy really was about. And if you don't believe me, read his books.
Amen.
Hallelujah. Bob, it's been awesome having you on with us. Any last words?
Yeah, I want to just take a minute to thank David again. We have been blessed here in Orlando to have a 25-year relationship with David, and what he did early on to lend his credibility to our movement meant a great deal, because he was taking it to a much broader audience. And that's why this house is here today, and it represents what it does. And David, we owe you a huge debt of gratitude. Thank you.
Thank all you guys for doing what you're doing. And I thank Jack Kerouac for being around and putting up with me and all the other people. And the biggest thing that we can all do while we're here is to make a contribution. That's kind of the idea. And foster creativity in others. So on that note, since we don't want to go overtime, I can accompany you, Bob, if you want to read something, and I'll play discreetly behind you until we get there.
How much time do you think we have, Pamela?
Great.
Well, we're overtime, so just a little bit. Read what you want.
Okay, this is about finding Fred DeWitt's photos of Kerouac. And by the way, April 8th, I'm going to be at the St. Petersburg Museum of History talking about Kerouac in Florida. I'd love to see you all down there. The first time I set eyes on Kerouac's notebooks in New York, and the time Carol Ney produced the first edition copy of On the Road she had hidden in her apartment, were high points in my literary journey through Jack Kerouac's Florida years. An intriguing tip provided another heart-stopping moment in my journey. During a freelance interview I was conducting with the late photographer, painter, and educator, Bob Enchedton, he asked, and oh, by the way, question, aren't you the guy doing all that research on Kerouac? And I told him I was. And he says, well, maybe you need to talk to Fred DeWitt. He photographed Kerouac in Orlando, I think. And I found out the best part later. DeWitt was not only still alive, he lived a short distance from where I worked, about a block. For years, I had searched for a visual record of Kerouac in Orlando. The only photographs I'd ever seen were a couple of stills snapped by renowned photographer Robert Frank. In April 1958, Kerouac had piled into Frank's station wagon for a road trip down to Florida. Frank had helped Kerouac and the mayor move out of the Clouser back porch apartment back up to Long Island. Frank had taken a couple of pictures of Kerouac getting ready to leave Orlando. But as far as I knew, that was it. When I called Frank in New York to ask him about the photos, he was in no mood to be bothered. I should have taken a slower, more differential route with the aging filmmaker photographer, but patience has never been my strong suit. Needless to say, no information was forthcoming. But the breakthrough came in January of 1958. Time magazine had dispatched a young photographer to shoot Kerouac for an upcoming book review, and DeWitt was that young photographer. More than 4 decades after that photo shoot, I found Fred DeWitt's number in an Orlando phone book. Gave him a call. He had a hard time remembering the shoot and had no idea who Jack Kerouac was. Then again, it had been a very long time. But DeWitt was a good sport and agreed to meet me over at the Orlando house. By that time, John and Carol Ney had moved on, leaving the back porch apartment vacant. On a sweltering August Sunday morning, DeWitt met me there, wearing dark framed black glasses and a flannel shirt, much like the kind Kerouac preferred, despite the heat. Looking around, he started to clear the cobwebs from his mind, and he started to show me. He said, "Now, wait a minute, I remember I pulled alongside here." DeWitt motioned to a grassy area beside the house that no one, not one of us previously, had recognized that this was the former driveway of their house. He was waiting for me in the doorway with his left arm propped up against the door frame, Fred DeWitt recalled. It took a gentle shove to open the door to Kerouac's old apartment, and DeWitt and I traipsed through the musty, brown-paneled sitting area. This was before it was renovated, and I got to tell you, it was just like a dark hovel. The only way to get into Kerouac's bedroom at the time was through the bathroom. In view of Kerouac standing as a new star of America's literary scene in early 1958, it gave me pause to think of the ramshackle conditions which he had been living. I remember a lone light bulb, the roll of teletype paper, and a manual typewriter, DeWitt told me while surveying Kerouac's tiny bedroom. It was obvious that being there sparked DeWitt's memory. He pointed out where Kerouac's writing table had been. And the men got on well, talking about contemporary subjects like the Cuban Revolution. Kerouac was friendly and helped DeWitt get the shots he needed. Freelance photographers will often shoot 10 rolls of film, even though there's space dedicated to just one picture. But DeWitt wasn't like that. He had one roll dedicated to the shoot. It's right the first time. Also the mantra of DeWitt's shy subject that day. I never even saw the images as prints, DeWitt recounted. I just developed the roll and rushed it off to New York. In fact, the only photo from the shoot DeWitt ever saw was the one featured in Time's February 24th, 1958 issue. So where were the rest? I asked him. I don't have them, DeWitt said. So I contacted Time's archivists on the off chance that they might still have the DeWitt negatives in a drawer somewhere. They didn't, but to my astonishment, they offered to email me the contact sheets of DeWitt's historic images. Would that do? Oh my God, yes, it would do. And opening that email attachment a few days later, as I mentioned, this was the photo I saw. This is the one where Jack is looking directly at the camera. And I still remember to this day looking at that picture, and it was as if Jack was saying to me, "What the hell took you so long?" While DeWitt's photographs of Kerouac were flattering, Time's review of the Subterraneans in that issue was not. The critic called Kerouac's writing tawdry and slapdash. He proclaimed Kerouac the latrine laureate of Hobohemia. Fred DeWitt was terribly embarrassed by the magazine's humiliating treatment of Kerouac. I remember going back there red-faced with my hat in my hand, Fred DeWitt recounted that August day. And I told Kerouac, "If you want to take a swing at me, go ahead. I'll understand." But those kind of reviews were becoming commonplace for Kerouac. And in the end, he said to the photographer, "It's okay. I'm used to it," Kerouac told him. "It's publicity." It's publicity.
Good night, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Bob Keeling. Thank you, Pamela Dickerson. Thank you, Anthony Demarbiex. Thank you, the people from Demarbiex. Thank you, Jerry Chimo and Al Hinkle, and all of you, and all the way from the Emerald Isle in Dublin. We'll see you next week. Until then, a bientôt, which means goodbye, you all, if you live